crazy, Pepper. I just finally know what I have to do. And I know in my heart that it's right.
2008 was a major year for superhero cinema, and I suppose cinema in general, because it saw a couple genre-defining releases. The Dark Knight, which saw a wave of darker superhero films and influenced the Zack Snyder DC films, and Iron Man, which would lay the groundwork for the eventual mega franchise of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. When I was a kid, I loved both of these films, and I have fond memories of seeing them both in theaters, and I think the 1-2 punch of The Dark Knight and Iron Man is what really got me interested in superheroes and comic books, as both seem to show that there could be more to these characters than just people who fight supervillains. Today, however, I'm here to specifically talk about Iron Man and the first part of my Look Back series on the MCU. I'm hoping to make fully comprehensive videos on these films because there's so much stuff in these universes at this point that it may be hard for a new fan to approach entering the universe. So hopefully these videos can break down the film, the development of the film, and briefly how it compares to the source material. For this video I watched the film a few times, watched all the behind the scenes featurettes, and read several comic books for comparison's sake. So with all that said, let's take a look back at Iron Man from 2008. Tony Stark is a weapons inventor that owns Stark Industries. After a weapons test, he's ambushed and kidnapped by terrorists working for the Ten Rings. While in captivity, Tony makes a suit of armor and he manages to escape. When he arrives home, he decides he's going to expand the idea and become a vigilante in order to help people and right the wrongs of his past, while also shuttering his weapons program. This angers Obadiah Stane, a mentor figure to Tony, who thinks he should continue to make weapons. Soon he learns Tony has escaped using a suit of armor, and Obadiah manages to create his own armor, becoming the Ironmonger. Tony and Ironmonger fight, and Obadiah is killed. At a press conference after the climatic fight, Tony reveals to the world that he is Iron Man.
The truth is, I am Iron Man.
Iron Man has a pretty interesting development history. The film bounced around from studio to studio, director to director, and star to star for around 2 decades before it was finally put into active development. Fox, Universal, and New Line Cinema all had the rights to Iron Man at various points before it reverted back to Marvel itself in 2005. Actors like Tom Cruise and Nick Cage were both in the conversation to play Tony, and out there directors like Quentin Tarantino and Stuart Gordon were in talks to direct. The closest the script came to being produced pre-Marvel was a script by X-Men scribe David Hayter in 2004, which would also fall through. Interestingly, this script would have had Howard Stark return and become War Machine to fight Iron Man. Ultimately, as I said, Marvel got the rights back and decided to make this its first film. This was at a time before Disney owned Marvel, so it's interesting that Iron Man was basically a massive independent film. Paramount Pictures signed on to distribute the film, so the character rights were still wholly owned by Marvel, unlike a deal like Universal or Fox, which would see the film rights being totally owned by those companies while they were producing films. To gain financing for this new universe being created, Marvel leveraged their characters. If this film failed, the creditors would have owned Marvel's characters and could do with them what they saw fit, which likely would have meant the assets would have been auctioned off to reclaim the $500 million stake Marvel borrowed. So in a lot of ways, Marvel was gambling the fate of their company on a B-list superhero no one's ever heard of. Thankfully, a pretty solid team was assembled around the film, with Jon Favreau of Elf and Zathura fame tied to direct. The titular role was passed through several actors, though it was mainly down to Sam Rockwell and Robert Downey Jr. Due to Robert Downey Jr.'s rocky past, Marvel was unsure if it was safe to rest the franchise on his shoulders, but ultimately, impressive screen tests and Jon Favreau's behest led to the actor taking the role he would make only $500,000 for on the first film. This is a figure that would eventually balloon as his time in the MCU went on. And while Sam Rockwell missed out on the project, he would be approached to play Justin Hammer in the sequel, an interesting mirror to Tony. However, I think we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. Picking a villain was also a challenge for the production. The original idea was to have the Mandarin be the lead villain before it was changed to the Crimson Dynamo and finally the Ironmonger. Jeff Bridges was cast as Obadiah and was originally cast as a supporting character when the Mandarin was the lead, but eventually was promoted to the main villain later on in pre-production. Additionally, to fill out the cast, Terrence Howard was added as Rhodey, Gwyneth Paltrow as Pepper, and Jon Favreau himself would play Tony's driver Happy. The crew considered the film to be like a $200 million student film. This was mostly due to the fact that the actors were encouraged by Favreau to improvise, so that the exposition scenes would feel more natural and less dull. And I think this is what led to Tony Stark's trademark humor, which at this point has become the trademark humor for the Marvel Cinematic Universe in general, for better or worse. Hell, even iconic images like Tony sitting at the press conference or Tony getting the Burger King were late additions made up by Robert Downey Jr. on the spot. Jon Favreau really wanted the special effects and practical effects to blend, and I think they did an amazing job. This film saw the suits being made mostly practically and then enhanced through CGI. This causes the suits to look really good in my opinion, probably even better than the suits created for the films that came much later, mostly due to the fact that those are mainly CG heavy, and these are mostly practical with some CG enhancements. And besides a few moments in the film, the CGI looks really well blended. The practical suits were made at Sam Winston Studios, while the main CG work was handled by Industrial Lights and Magic with additional outside help. During the production, the cinematic universe aspect wasn't fully figured out. Originally, the end credits scene featured Sam Jackson as Nick Fury, referring to the X-Men, Hulk, and Spider-Man.
As if gamma accidents, radioactive bug bites, and assorted mutants weren't enough. I have to deal with a spoiled brat who doesn't play well with others and wants to keep all his toys to himself.
Thankfully, for legal reasons, that was cut and changed to Tony being introduced to the idea of the Avengers, and the rest is history.
Who the hell are you?
Nick Fury, director of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Oh.
I'm here to talk to you about the Avenger Initiative.
Tony's origins are pretty similar to the comics, but with some modernizing tweaks to the film. In the comics, Tony is captured in Vietnam after a weapons test by a warlord named Wong Chu, who runs a guerrilla unit for the Viet Cong. Much like the film, he's captured to create weapons for his captors, and there's a ticking clock element as Tony must create a suit before his captors can figure out what's going on. In the film, Tony is helped by scientist Ho Yinsen. Much like in the comics, they're essentially the same characters serving the same function. They sacrifice themselves to protect Tony while his suit powers up. Unlike the movie, Tony in the comics isn't an overtly bad man, and in the early comics, they don't really demonize him for his profession. In fact, in the early comics, they kind of embrace his profession, as he creates several weapons. A lot of them are more humane tools made to help soldiers, like his rocket roller skates, but there are some real weapons in there as well. Initially, Tony's trapped in the full suit in the comics, but this is pretty quickly dropped by his second issue, where he only needs to wear a chest plate that he needs to recharge intermittently. Tony also doesn't use the arc reactor power initially, rather there's just powerful transmitters in his suit. In the comics, Tony leaves his identity as Iron Man a secret through his early adventures, and has a series of love interests rather than just Pepper. Happy isn't a very humorous character in the first movie, however as time goes on that becomes more evident, with his character climaxing in the Spider-Man films where he's quite the humorous character. In the comics, Happy has that name because he's constantly serious, so the name is kind of an ironic play of words. Happy was once a prize fighter, but never had the heart to finish off his opponents. After saving Stark during a car race, he hires him as his driver and confidant, who Tony relies on to help him be Iron Man without asking any questions. He also has a crush on Pepper Potts, making it a bit more of a love triangle than we see in the film. Happy loves her, she loves Tony, and Tony lives a lifestyle which leaves Pepper neglected. That idea is pretty much dropped in the film for a more overt love connection between Pepper and Tony, with Happy not really being in that equation. As I said, Pepper loves Tony, but is pretty much ignored by him in the comics. In the film, Tony's a lot more open with Pepper, and she has a more expanded role than just a girl who swoons over Stark constantly. In the film, Ironmonger is a friend and confidant of Tony, who has a major role at Stark Industries. During his bid for power within the company, he orders a hit on Tony, which the Ten Rings attempt, however they kidnap Tony instead, leading to the creation of his armor. After Tony's return, Obadiah tries to convince Tony not to stop the weapons program, but when Tony fails to do this, he creates his own suit of armor and becomes the Ironmonger in order to try to kill Tony and sell the armor to the highest bidder. In the comics, Obadiah is a much different character. After witnessing the suicide of his father, Obadiah starts treating life as a game, so he takes over Stark Industries and tries to get Tony to succumb to his alcoholism. However, when this fails, and Tony starts donning the Iron Man armor again, Obadiah is forced to take matters into his own hands and dons his own armor, the Ironmonger suit. The difference primarily stems from the background of the characters. For one, the original Ironmonger is much younger, in his late 20s or early 30s. Secondly, rather than being an established figure in the company, he simply takes over the company as an outside entity. Both Obadiahs ultimately die in the end, with the movie version being killed by the arc reactor, and the comics version dying by suicide, much like his father. However, in a broad sense, the characters functionally play a similar role, trying to steal Stark Industries from Tony, and creating a suit of armor as a manufacturable weapon they can sell for a lot of money. Phil Coulson is an original character made for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In this film, he doesn't do much but talk to Pepper, but he becomes a more important character as time goes on, so we'll touch on him later. Nick Fury only cameos in this film, but much like Coulson, gets more important as time goes on. In the comics, you may notice Fury is white, but Fury's appearance is based on his Ultimate Comics counterpart, where he's modeled after Sam Jackson. We don't get much personality here off of a few sentences, so we'll come back to him further when we touch on Iron Man 2. I wanted to add a segment to these videos where I talk about notable equipment. In Iron Man's case, let's talk about the armors in the movie. Mach 1 is Tony's original armor he used to escape the cave the 10 Rings had him captured in. It's pretty different from the more standard Iron Man armors, as Tony made it from spare parts. It is inspired by his original Mach 1 armor from the comics that Tony used to escape captivity. However, in the comics, Tony kept using the armor for a time after his escape, even repainting it gold eventually, whereas in the movie, this armor is pretty quickly dropped. Mach 2 was not based on any comic book armor. The reason this armor came about was because filmmaker Jon Favreau wanted a middle step armor between Mach 1 and Mach 3. This suit was only used to do a brief flight test before freezing and being replaced with the Mach 3 armor. The Mach 3 armor is based on the Model 2 armor from the comics mixed with the design of the Extremis armor. However, functionally it's more like the former. This is the main suit Tony uses in the film and is the one he goes up against the Ironmonger with. The arc reactor is what keeps Tony alive in the film after shrapnel got into his body close to his heart. He creates an initial version in the cave, but this is quickly switched to a more powerful, refined model. In the comics, Tony had a whole chest plate he was forced to wear in order to survive, rather than just the arc reactor. The Ironmonger suit is based off the Mach 1 suit, though it is improved to be bigger and more powerful. In the comics, Obadiah's suit is a wholly original design, however it's controlled partially by computers, as Obadiah would not be able to operate the suit at Tony's level without AI help. Jarvis is an AI in Tony's suit that helps him operate his HUD and give him useful information. In the comics, Jarvis is a butler, but the filmmakers wanted to differentiate him from Batman and Alfred, so he's an AI played by Paul Bettany. In the early comics, there's no Jarvis equivalent in Tony's suit. Iron Man features a very brief end credit scene that features Nick Fury talking to Tony Stark about the Avengers Initiative. This scene would of course eventually set up 2012's Avengers, but it also acts as a basis for why Nick Fury is so prominent in Iron Man 2. While this isn't the most interesting post-credit scene Marvel would put together, it is notable as being a first from the company and would start a trend that many studios to this day still utilize the Marvel-style end credit stinger to set up future films in their respective franchises. As I mentioned earlier, Marvel initially wanted to reference Spider-Man, the X-Men, and the Hulk, but ultimately decided upon simply setting up the Avengers. An interesting fact is that this tactic was actually inspired by the end credits of Ferris Bueller, and Kevin Feige himself said this would inspire him to sit to the end of each movie he watched. Another pretty interesting fact is that Sam Jackson, who played Nick Fury, wasn't actually contracted to do more films. He kinda just showed up for a day of shooting and did a cameo, in part because he learned Nick Fury in the Ultimate Universe was based on his likeness. Alright, so this is the point of the video where I give my thoughts on Iron Man. Honestly, I really enjoyed it, and it might be my favorite Marvel Cinematic Universe film. I know that feels like I'm calling it early, and it may partially be nostalgia, but it honestly is just a really solid film. For one, I think the casting of all the characters was pretty spot on. Of course, you have Robert Downey Jr., who can not only look the part of Iron Man, but also had a troubled past not too dissimilar to Tony Stark. And I think he brings that baggage to the role in the best way possible. And while the comic book Tony Stark is less humorous, I think it really spices up the character to have this kind of comedic edge. His arc through the film is pretty believable, and we get how this selfish narcissist ends up becoming one of the greatest superheroes of all time. A lot of these films don't really try for a deep arc, but this film is different. At the start, we see Tony, who cares about himself and his reputation over others, profiting on weapons because if not him, then someone else would. Rationalizing why he isn't such a bad guy, but eventually all that changes when he meets his weapons firsthand and learns the potential damage that it can cause people when one of his own missiles blows up and puts shrapnel near his heart. Tony eventually learns to swallow his pride and tries his best to help people and make up for his sins from the past. Of course, the supporting cast is pretty great too. Terrence Howard played a great Rhodey. Don't get me wrong, I love Don Cheadle, but I would have been curious to see what Terrence Howard would have done had he continued in the role. I think he always came off more military than Cheadle's take, whereas Cheadle was always more of a comedic bounce-off for Tony. Gwyneth Paltrow's Pepper Potts is also pretty good. I think the scenes where she's bouncing off of Tony are genuinely some of the highlights of the film, and it's interesting to see how this somewhat troubled relationship turns into a romance. However, I always get the sense from Gwyneth Paltrow that she feels a bit above the material and that she's kind of phoning it in compared to the other actors at times. Jeff Bridges is amazing in everything, and this role is no different. It seems a little more reserved for him, but it also seems like he had a lot of fun playing both Obadiah and when he climbed in the suit to play Ironmonger. In terms of the action, I think it's top notch. This film's set pieces are more about the spectacle of what if I was Iron Man than the later MCU movies, which are more about the fights. And I like MCU fight scenes, don't get me wrong, but I feel these immersive set pieces connect to the actual meat of the film more than some of the later MCU set pieces, which almost feel disconnected from the larger plot at times. Tony's dogfight or first flight are both vital character moments for Tony, but they're also really neat set pieces. I also appreciated that this film had more of a real-world edge, with the Ten Rings being clearly a Taliban-like organization, and seeing more of Tony's everyday life pretty unfiltered, be it the womanizing, the partying, or his weapon testing. Since most of these films don't feature secret identities, I feel it's easy for the films to fall into relying too heavily on the superhero plot and forgetting the character behind the mask. This film really doesn't have that problem, in my opinion. All this isn't to discredit the final confrontation with Ironmonger, which is pretty good. Certainly not the best fight in the MCU, but regardless, it had several fun set pieces, like the freeway fight and the roof climax. The film also features probably the most iconic moment in the MCU for me as well, which is at the end when he reveals that he is Iron Man and he fully embraces his new role in society. I remember seeing that moment in the theater vividly for the first time and just being floored. I thought it was super awesome, and I think every time I've watched that moment since, it still hits just the right beat for me. The cinematography holds up really well. A lot of the films from the time don't, in my opinion, mostly due to the harsh color correction, but this film doesn't overdo it on the color correction as it easily could have. On top of that, the effects are great. I think the suits look better than they do later in the series, often because of the larger amount of practical effects grounding it in the real world. If I had a complaint, it would be the score, which I found frankly unmemorable. I think Tony's character is much more associated with the licensed AC/DC tracks, to the point where in Far From Home, the song they use to call back from Tony isn't a score, rather it's AC/DC's Back in Black. Overall, I don't really have any problems with this film. It has a strong energy that keeps me engaged from start to finish, and it's very human for an MCU film. And I think it's a really fun and cool movie that deserves more credit than just being the first MCU film. For this film, I watched Iron Man a couple of times, and I can say with confidence I would have watched it a few more times and not been bored at all. It's just an infinitely rewatchable, energetic blast, and I think it's just genuinely an awesome film. In the early comics, there isn't much subtext to Iron Man. He's just a guy who made a cool weapon and decides to become a superhero with it. In the film, however, the creative team wanted to add more depth to the Iron Man character and give him an actual reason to want to be Iron Man. Tony Stark lived a life that was a facade. He was a brilliant designer and used those skills to create weapons. He wasn't very humble, as we see. He doesn't show up to the award ceremony at the start of the film. And he uses his fortune as a basis to create hollow relationships with people like the reporters at the start as well. Tony leads a pretty empty life. However, when Tony escapes the cave, he's reborn as a new man. Essentially, he realizes the real-world harm his weapons caused. He finally understands his true impact on the world, and it's not a good one. So he reinvents himself and becomes the Iron Man. And his new powers allow him to right the wrongs of his past. However, we still have the original Darkseid as personified by Obadiah Stane. Obadiah is the legacy of Stark Industries, and with his death comes a new life for both Stark and Stark Industries. At the end of the film, Tony admits that he's Iron Man, a moment I think seals his fate, as he will no longer be seen as Tony Stark, but will now be seen as Iron Man, a hero designed specifically to help the people his legacy originally hurt. It's a pretty cool theme, and I think it sets up a thesis for the rest of the Iron Man films going forward, but we'll come back to that another day. For this video, I read a fair bit of material to immerse myself in Iron Man's world on the screen and on the page. For information on his origin and the origins of his supporting casts and suits, I read Tales of Suspense 39 through 72, which I read through the Essentials line of Marvel graphic novels, though you can also read them digitally through Marvel's Masterworks line, physically through the Masterworks line, and a million other ways. For information on Obadiah and the Ironmonger, I read Iron Man 193 through 200, which is available as a graphic novel, Iron Man Ironmonger, on Comicsexology as well as physically. However, the physical book seems hard to come by, so I'd probably either pick up the single-issue comics or just read it through Comicsexology. These are the primary resources I used for the mainline canon, but there's a good chunk of origin retellings, both canon and not, for Iron Man, so feel free to feel around a bit if you're interested in reading some Iron Man comics. What else is there for me to really say? I think Iron Man's a great film with a really interesting history behind it. And while it deviated from the comics in some respects, it also did an amazing job of adapting the comics into something that works really well on the screen. The film ended up making $585 million, making it a pretty big success and paving the way for Marvel's seemingly unbreakable streak of hits. It made its star Robert Downey Jr. a superstar actor on the level of people like Tom Cruise, and ultimately is just an amazing movie, worthy of more praise than I think it gets. Ah yes, The Incredible Hulk. Up there is one of the most notoriously hated MCU films, both because it's not very good, but also because its star Ed Norton would leave the MCU after this film to be replaced by Mark Ruffalo, who both looks very different, but also acts the part in a decidedly different way than Norton did. I think some people get confused on whether or not this is canon, and it definitely is, with footage from this film showing up in the Avengers, and the events of the film being referenced later on, even with a few characters pulling over like Thunderbolt Ross. We even have a little Robert Downey Jr. cameo at the end, which will be mentioned later in the video. This film is also confusing due to the strange development history it has, starting off as a sequel to 2003's Hulk, and eventually the film dropping that angle and diving headfirst into being an MCU film. It's also notable as being the only Hulk film in the MCU. This is mostly due to the fact that Universal owns distribution rights to solo Hulk films, while Marvel Studios owns creative rights, so Marvel could make a sequel, however Universal would take a pretty good bite of the profits with the distribution deal. So Marvel wants to focus on other characters that Disney owns and distributes. Anyways, we'll touch on this more when we talk about the film's production. Unlike Iron Man, Hulk had 3 live-action movies and a TV series before ever joining the MCU. We had a long-running TV series in the 70s with Lou Ferrigno as the Hulk and Bill Bixby as Bruce Banner, which would spin off into 2 TV films, and as stated before, the 2003 adaptation of the Hulk, which this would end up being a loose sequel to. And while it's tempting to call it the 2003 Hulk the first MCU film, that isn't really the case. I pined over the facts, and here they are. Supporting evidence this theory shows that 2003's Hulk ends where this film started, with a 5-year time jump between the film, which tracks with the real time between this film and the 2003 adaptation. Specific names of people who died at Hulk's hands in the 2003 film are also on a list in this film, and the 2003 film was even eyeballing Ed Norton to star. However, evidence to the contrary is more damning. For one, the opening credits establish that Bruce Banner got his powers while the government was attempting to recreate Captain America's super soldier serum, while the 03 film establishes the more standard gamma accident origin. Secondly, Glenn Talbot is a major player in the 03 film and would die in that film. However, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. has its own version of that character. Third, the film was fully recast from the 2003 adaptation. Though the MCU is prone to recasts, as we see this film's star be replaced with Mark Ruffalo later on, it is pretty well damning evidence when literally no one from the original cast comes back. Fourth, tonally the films are very different. Although you could take something like the first two Thor films versus the third, and they're tonally very different films. Finally, we have a different power set, with the 03 Hulk growing bigger as he gets mad. Ultimately, the way I see it, 2003's Hulk is not canon. The filmmakers simply used the 2003 Hulk as a jumping off point for the MCU's adaptation, but the continuity of the 2003 film doesn't really affect the 2008 film. And ultimately, the nice thing about the 2008 film is that it was designed to work as both the sequel to the 03 film for the general audience, but also as a basis for Hulk's involvement in this new world Kevin Feige was trying to create through the MCU. The plot is your standard Hulk story. Bruce Banner's been on the run for years and is attempting to contain the Hulk using methods like meditation and monitoring his heart rate. However, after he's cut at his job working at a bottling factory, some of his blood drips into a bottle, leading to our Watcher informant catching radiation poisoning after ingesting the bottle of soda. This causes the military to raid the area and find Banner, who quickly gets the help from Mr. Blue, who thinks he can help cure him of his alter ego. So Banner heads back to the US, where he gets help from Mr. Blue and reunites with his former flame, Betty Ross. He's again attacked, but manages to flee with Betty, and they go on the run. Soon they meet with Mr. Blue, who is able to reverse the gamma radiation and cure Banner, but the leader of the squad, tasked with finding the Hulk, Emil Blonsky, has Mr. Blue combine his super soldier powers with that of the Hulk's gamma radiation, making him the Abomination. Abomination starts to rampage, and Banner tries jumping from the military's helicopter to transform into the Hulk, which works, and the Hulk and the Abomination end up fighting. Ultimately, the Hulk wins the fight and goes back on the run. The Hulk went through a fairly long development history, starting as a sequel to The Hulk by Ang Lee before being retrofitted into a wholly original film series set within the newly established Marvel Cinematic Universe. Universal lost production rights on the project as too much time elapsed between sequels for The Hulk 2003, however they still had distribution rights. Remember, this was at a time where Marvel was still independent and not owned by Disney, so they would need a distributor, whether it be Paramount with the main Avengers films, or the Universal with the Hulk film. I assume this is why we never got a follow-up, as after the Disney buyout, Disney was trying to distribute all of the films through their own production company, but I digress. The film would use the semi-recency of the Hulk to ditch a standard origin plot, but would still retool the mechanics of the Hulk. For example, the Hulk varied size in the Ang Lee version, getting as tall as 15 feet, where this film locked Hulk in at a meager 9 feet. Louis Leterrier would end up directing, but was skeptical at first until Marvel approved some of his concept art that he commissioned. Once it was clear their visions for the Hulk aligned, he signed on. Similarly, Ed Norton wasn't sure if he wanted to do the role because he wasn't sure they could do the character justice, and he wasn't used to working with a major corporation like Marvel on a project of this scale. Ed Norton was also a purported fan of the Hulk and didn't want to let it down his childhood self. Soon the cast came together, Tim Roth joining as the Abomination or Blonsky, Liv Tyler taking the role of Betty, and William Hurt taking the role of General Ross. This was set to rejuvenate the Hulk franchise while also staying a little more true to the source material than the Ang Lee edition. Ultimately, the movie underperformed, making $250 million on a $160 million budget. Production was also pretty sloppy, with Ed Norton departing his role as the Hulk, in part because around 70 minutes of footage was cut for time and various disagreements with the studio, leaving Norton ultimately pretty unhappy with the final product. The underperformance of this film was also probably a major reason we never got a sequel, on top of the muddled distribution rights. Mark Ruffalo would eventually take Ed Norton's role starting in The Avengers and has been a fan favorite ever since, with the She-Hulk show coming to Disney Plus eventually starring Ruffalo as the Hulk, but I digress for now. The Hulk in this film borrows from a cocktail of versions of the character. In the film, the Army is attempting to create a new super soldier program which goes wrong and turns Banner into the Hulk. The experiment itself mirrors that of the TV adaptation, but the super soldier stuff was pulled straight from the Ultimate Comics version of the Hulk. If you don't know, the Ultimate Universe was an attempt by Marvel in the early 2000s to create a contemporary version of their universe with a secondary continuity, revamping a lot of characters like Spider-Man, the X-Men, Hulk, Thor, Captain America, etc., with slightly different personalities, slightly different origins, and all that good stuff. In the original comics, Banner turned to the Hulk when he was caught in a gamma bomb explosion while trying to save an unsuspecting teenager, Rick Jones. Rick would be dropped from the film origin altogether. In the comics, the Hulk was gray at first. This would quickly change to the more iconic green version as time went on. Hulk also didn't change when he was angry at first. That stuff came much later in the timeline, but I digress. As most versions in recent years, this one included, go by the standard modern understanding of the Hulk, which is that Bruce Banner gets in an accident and becomes a big green monster when angry. Overall, I think they did a pretty decent job bringing a believable Hulk to the screen, and Ed Norton does a decent enough job as Banner. In the comics, Betty Ross starts off as a standard love interest, mostly just complaining that she doesn't know where Bruce Banner is, but as time goes on, she gets a lot more interesting. But the long and short of it, and what this film adapts, is Betty Ross as a damsel. In the film, she's played by Liv Tyler. I don't think the film gives her enough to really do to escape the role of generic love interest, which is a shame because Liv Tyler's great in the film and really embodies the character. It's just the film fails to add any depth to her. I also found Ed Norton a bit stiff during romantic scenes, which kind of undercuts Betty's whole role in the film. General Ross in the film and the comics serve the same purpose. He's just a guy obsessed with capturing or killing the Hulk. The film adds more of an undertone on him trying to fix a mistake, whereas in the early comics he's fairly clueless to who the Hulk is, and is just angry and after him. I thought William Hurt was perfect for the role and probably was the best casting in the film, as his Ross feels like he's straight out of Hulk Gray or the early comics I read for this watch through. The leader was basically just hinted at in this film. I suppose you could call him a secondary villain, but he's more of an ally in this film, being Mr. Blue to Banner's Mr. Green. The comics never had him as an ally to the Hulk, and the idea of the leader in the comics is that he's essentially the opposite of the Hulk. Radiation makes him really smart, but he's fairly weak. Abomination in the comics was a Russian spy who turned into the Abomination after being exposed to Banner's gamma ray machine. In the comics, he's more animal-like and almost has a fish-like appearance. In the film, the thesis of his design was to make him, well, an abomination, with bones breaking through his skin, and he's also a bit taller and stronger than the Hulk. In the film, he isn't a Russian spy, just an overambitious soldier working under General Ross, who has the leader attempt to enhance him with a formula made out of Hulk's blood. I like Tim Roth in the role, probably in big part due to him being Tim Roth, and he's amazing in everything. And I think the overambitious soldier kind of adds more to Abomination than just evil Russian spy that we got during the Cold War. Leonard Samson is in this film as well, essentially as a cameo to set up the character. In the film, he's dating Betty, and much like the leader, his character sadly never really goes anywhere in the film. However, in the comics, he gets exposed to gamma ray particles and becomes a real strongman. The film was adapted from a lot of comics, as I've covered, but the one that the crew took the most inspiration from was Hulk Gray. And honestly, other than the scene where Hulk takes Betty to the cave in the rain, which happens in the book and the film, they aren't too similar. And the sad thing is, Hulk Gray would have made an amazing film. Basically, the setup is the Hulk reminiscing about his time as the Gray Hulk when he first changed into the Hulk with Doc Samson. And the story is a touching, smart, and well put together superhero story put together by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale, the team behind Batman The Long Halloween. I'd highly recommend Hulk Gray, but don't expect it to essentially be like reading a comic book version of the film, as I still think the film didn't borrow as much from Hulk Gray as things like the special features would have you believe. There isn't a post-credit scene per se in this film, but there's an end-of-film stinger that showcases the future of Marvel in a similar vein to your traditional post-credit scene, with Tony Stark showing up and telling General Ross that he's part of a team that's coming together, alluding to the Avengers. It doesn't say much, and it's kind of a weird combination for Tony Stark to go to Ross, especially considering that Ross wasn't going to join the team, and that Tony Stark in Iron Man 2 is essentially chastised and not invited to the team, but whatever. As far as the film's quality, I don't think it's the worst thing ever, but I don't really care for it. The acting was well done, and so is the set pieces, but between the set pieces, I find the movie kind of boring with nothing compelling to really say. I think the romance between Ed Norton and Liv Tyler as Betty and Bruce is kind of weak. Like, I think Ed Norton's a little stiff in those scenes. And we basically just see Hulk on the run and the military pursuing him, leading to a lot of fun, unique moments. And while we see Hulk on the run and the military pursuing him, which leads to a lot of fun and unique moments, nothing really elevates the plot except for a few moments like Hulk and Betty on the cliffside with her calming him down. I think a lot of the sets are great too, like the bottling plant and the hills in Brazil. As I said, the set pieces are amazing and there are a lot of strong effects, but yeah, I honestly don't have a lot to say about this one because there simply isn't much to it. It's just a boring, subpar superhero film in my eyes. I also didn't find the score that compelling. There are a lot of decent Marvel scores, but this is one that didn't really grab me. In conclusion, I think The Incredible Hulk has a more interesting history in becoming a film than it is a compelling film in and of itself. It has its moments, and I like some of the acting, but that can't save an overall subpar story from being just that, a subpar story. Iron Man 2 is our first sequel in the MCU, coming out 2 years after the last MCU project, The Incredible Hulk. This felt like the first project they decided to go all in on the cinematic universe concept, with Sam Jackson's Nick Fury put in a supporting role and Scarlett Johansson's Black Widow being introduced for the first time to tie heavily into the at-the-time in development Avengers film. Jon Favreau returns to direct this film, and with all that said, let's take a look back at 2010's Iron Man 2. Iron Man 2 takes place around Tony's Stark Expo event. Tony is facing an exponential crisis when he's getting poisoned by the arc reactor that saves his life. This leads Stark to fall into drinking and walking back a bit on his arc. Rhodey sees what's going on with Tony and wants to forfeit his Iron Man armors to the government, which the government is actively trying to get at this time due to Senate hearings about trying to get the weapons technology from Stark. At the same time, we have Ivan Vanko, who wants to get revenge on Tony Stark for his father essentially throwing Vanko's father under the bus back in the day. This leads to him developing his own suit with whips to try to kill Tony. When this fails, he's saved by Justin Hammer, who recruits him to make Iron Man suits for Hammer Industries. However, Vanko creates drones instead, and on the night of Hammer's Stark Expo, the suits are taken over by Vanko, who uses the suits to attack Tony and Rhodey, who are now Iron Man and War Machine respectively. They fight, and Vanko's drones are defeated. Jon Favreau developed Iron Man 2 as the second part in an Iron Man trilogy he originally hoped to see to its conclusion. It didn't take long after the original Iron Man for Terrence Howard to be replaced with Don Cheadle, who has held the part of Rhodey or War Machine ever since.
It's me. I'm here. Deal with it. Let's move on.
I just
Drop it. All right. I'll drop it.
Howard left due mostly to money negotiations. It's unknown if it was Marvel or Howard's legal team that pulled the plug, but regardless of how it went down, Don Cheadle took over the role and hasn't looked back since. Favreau and Robert Downey Jr. wanted to do an adaptation of Demon in the Bottle, but with their own twist on it, based on Robert Oppenheimer's experience after he created the atomic bomb. The script originally had several villains, including Ghost, who would later appear in Ant-Man and the Wasp years later, but ultimately it was whittled down to just Justin Hammer and Whiplash. Sam Jackson almost didn't come back, but after negotiations ultimately rejoined the cast along with Scarlett Johansson, joining as Black Widow, though the role initially was eyeballing Emily Blunt. The studio again went with Stan Winston Studios and ILM for most of the effects work, which looks pretty consistent with the first film. In this film, Tony felt a bit like a backstep when it comes to his arc, but I think it was an intentional choice that wouldn't fully pay off. As I said, the alcoholism arc was based on Robert Oppenheimer, but I think the alcoholism's a little undercooked in this film as it's really only one or two scenes where it affects Tony heavily. Tony's other big personal arc is that he never felt worthy to his father, and at the same time is being poisoned by the arc reactor. These arcs eventually merge when he learns his father did find him worthy, and figured that only Tony could find the hidden element his father discovered, which could also help him stop the poisoning that's happening through the arc reactor. Pepper hasn't changed much for this film, sadly, still kind of just being Tony's moral core while Tony's off doing crazy Iron Man stuff. Gwyneth Paltrow, I think, puts in a better performance here than the first film, but there isn't a lot to talk about with Pepper in this one. Rhodey finally suits up as War Machine after confiscating an armor from Tony, seeing that alcoholism has made him unhinged and believing the government would be better off with the armor. He goes to Tony's arch-rival Justin Hammer to arm the suit further, but eventually realizes the error of his ways and works with Tony to stop the rogue drones Justin Hammer sent out at the Stark Expo. Black Widow goes undercover as an assistant at Stark Industries to keep an eye on Tony. In reality, she's the secret agent Black Widow. In the comics, Black Widow started as a villain before eventually becoming a hero and worked frequently with people like S.H.I.E.L.D., Daredevil, the Avengers, and Hawkeye. Justin Hammer is a rival to Tony, who basically wants to create his own brand of Iron Man suits. In the comics, he was British, which was changed in the film to make him more similar to Tony, and also give him this image of an American industrialist. In a way, he's basically the mirror image of Tony if Tony was less brilliant, not humbled by the attack from the Ten Rings. Whiplash, or Ivan Vanko, hates Tony Stark and vows revenge on him after his father threw his father under the bus with illegal dealings. However, in the comics, there were several different Whiplashes. In the case of Ivan specifically, he wasn't introduced till mere months before the film came out. In the comics version, Vanko had a village slaughtered by an Iron Man imposter. This caused Vanko to be hell-bent on revenge, and he became the newest Whiplash. There's also Professor Vanko. That was only ever the Crimson Dynamo, but never Whiplash as far as I know. That version is probably closest to Vanko from the film, but rather than working with the Soviets in the film, Vanko was an independent until he joined Justin Hammer. Nick Fury in this film is able to use an antidote to buy Tony Stark a little more time alive. That said, his main goal is trying to get a copy of the Iron Man armor, as he wants Iron Man in the Avengers, but not Tony specifically. He is more important in this film, but still kind of just another cameo appearance from Nick Fury. The Iron Man films, specifically Iron Man 3, can be pretty well noted for the insane amount of armors in them, and this film certainly stepped it up from what we saw in the first film, though it's definitely not as crazy as Iron Man 3, which is going to be a mouthful. Mark IV, the armor is pretty close to the Mach 3, used to replace the suit after the damage done to the Mach 3 after his fight with Obadiah Stane. The suits are functionally similar. Mach 5 is Tony's portable suit, able to fit in a suitcase. It was used as a portable option during his fight with Whiplash. In the early comics, Tony was able to fit his suit into a briefcase, so this was probably an homage to that. Mach 6 was created when Tony created his new element that allowed for higher power output. This suit is notable for the triangular arc reactor port, something that was only used on this suit. This seems like a bit of a half step to Tony's classic Silver Centurion armor from the comics, which also had the triangular chest piece. War Machine Mach 1 was a retool of the Mach 2 Iron Man armor we saw in the original film, this time with a more militaristic twist. Much like the comics, it's basically a heavily armored black and silver version of Iron Man's primary suit. Hammer drones. Ivan Vanko created drones for Justin Hammer's company, one for each branch of the U.S. Armed Forces, that are more or less based on Iron Man's design philosophy. Whiplash had two different suits in the film, one which was a bare-bones chest plate with whips attached, and the other that was a more fortified Iron Man-like armor based on the Hammer drones. The main comic this film takes from is Demon in the Bottle, but again the film changed the storyline a bit. Demon in a Bottle from the comics, like the film, has Whiplash and Hammer, but unlike the film, also has a story with Namor the Submariner and other villains appear as well. In the comic story arc, which is actually more like two story arcs with the overarching drinking plot, Tony starts drinking heavily and it affects his role as Iron Man. It's two okay arcs with the drinking plot being unique for the time, but little else. The drinking is also very passively mentioned at first. In the film, Tony drinks because he's dying. In the comics, Tony gets a drinking problem. That's the key difference. I find this arc most memorable due to the cover of Iron Man 128, honestly, which caps off the run. The end credit scene in Iron Man 2 shows Phil Coulson drive up to Thor's hammer and call Fury about it. It's basic, but reveals that Thor was coming as the next movie. This is still an era of Marvel before they kind of locked down the end credits tease fully, and this was very bare bones, essentially made to tease that future film. I actually really like Iron Man 2. It's a large step down from the original Iron Man. It's kind of like a more popcorn munching version of the original film, if that makes sense. There's still some heavy themes, but the film is kind of a lighter ride. I like the villains in the film. It kind of does the mirror villain thing the first film did again with the rival suit and drones. However, it isn't very derivative in the final battle when compared to the original final battle, so it isn't the most bothersome thing. I love Justin Hammer. Just the idea that there's this entitled Stark without talent who was never humbled the way Tony was is kind of interesting to me. And Ivan Vanko ties well into the father themes throughout the film, and is certainly not a bad MCU villain, but he definitely isn't the most special or memorable either. This movie has a fast pace and it's pretty much exactly what I want from a popcorn action film. If I had one major criticism of the film, it would be that Tony kind of takes a half step back from his arc in the first film where he's a little more cocky and less responsible again. Although I think that was used as a way to handle the alcohol abuse arc, which I think was still a little undercooked. The score is kind of your generic Iron Man music, but suited the movie pretty well. Much like the first film, it was backed with AC/DC music, which really works well for the character and is something that I think is pretty pivotal and iconic for Tony Stark. This film doesn't have the biggest reading list, but I would recommend Demon in the Bottle, at least the second arc. It's a seminal Iron Man run, and the film kind of touches on it. I would also read some of the early appearances of Black Widow because that character's evolution is pretty interesting, but otherwise there aren't a ton of comics I can really recommend for this film. Overall, Iron Man 2 is more of a fun popcorn film than the first one, but I still really enjoy it for what it is. It introduced a lot of characters that have become important to the larger lore of the Infinity Saga and beyond, and expanded on smaller characters like Nick Fury. I don't really understand why this film is considered on the lower end of the MCU spectrum, just because it has such a strong kinetic energy to it, much like the first film, with people like Robert Downey Jr. making it frankly a really fun experience and a really great ride. Thor is the fourth MCU film following Iron Man 2. It stars Chris Hemsworth as Thor, Tom Hiddleston as Loki, and Natalie Portman as Jane Foster. Thor showed up in a bunch of Marvel cartoons before this film, but was only featured in live action once before the film, which was the TV film The Incredible Hulk Returns. This version of the character is pretty different from the MCU and comic books versions, being very Norse-based and dressing like a Viking. It's a little weird, but it's kind of a fun TV movie and a decent enough first appearance of Thor in live action. The plot of Thor goes as follows. After a break-in from a handful of frost giants, Thor loses his hammer and powers and is deemed unworthy, and then is sent to Earth. There he meets Jane Foster and her fellow scientists. Thor finds his hammer in a shield outpost, but learns he's unworthy. Over time, he eventually learns he is worthy again and regains his hammer. He also learns that his brother Loki conspired to make himself the king of Asgard, their home planet. After a fight, Loki is seemingly killed and Thor is trapped on Asgard. Thor was originally envisioned by Sam Raimi before he made Spider-Man, before being passed to David Goyer, and then Thor, like Iron Man, would sit in development hell until Marvel Studios and the MCU became a thing. When the film began production, they were eyeballing Guillermo del Toro, but he turned it down so that he could work on The Hobbit, which he'd also famously exit later on in its production. Daniel Craig was offered the role of Thor, but had to turn it down due to commitments with another franchise he helmed, James Bond. Ultimately, they went with Chris Hemsworth, who holds the role of Thor to this day and continues to appear in movies ever since. The main character of this film is Thor. Unlike the comics, he isn't ever Donald Blake, Thor's normal human identity, rather just being Thor throughout the film. That said, Donald Blake is referenced when Thor is arrested by S.H.I.E.L.D. midway through the film. Thor is deemed not worthy of his hammer in the film, but later regains the power after he learns some humanity and tries to defend the town he is in when the destroyers attack the town. Loki learns he's a frost giant, which ruins his relationship with his father. Ultimately, he sabotages his family and tries to start a war between Asgard and Jotunheim, the home of the frost giants. Much like the comics, he's a god of mischief and uses his powers to fight his brother and sabotage his family. Like in the comics, he's born from the frost giants. In the film, Jane is a scientist, but in the comics, she's a nurse. In both, she's a bit of a generic love interest, but at least in the film, she's fairly proactive, if a bit bland. And Natalie Portman puts in a decent enough performance as Jane. Odin is the king of Asgard, who years ago defended the Earth from an invasion by frost giants. Now he's an older king looking to pass the throne on to Thor. In the comics, Odin is pretty similar, basically just being the ruler of Asgard. Sif makes her first appearance, being a close friend and ally to Thor. This is pretty much what she is in the comics too, not much has really changed here with Sif. Hawkeye makes a cameo appearance as another tie-in to the upcoming Avengers film. His role is a definite cameo, so I'll touch on him more when he's further fleshed out in the Avengers itself, but needless to say, it's just one of those MCU cameo moments. The Destroyer is a prominent threat in the film, attacking a small town that Thor is residing in. In the comics, the Destroyer is a villain to Thor that is meant to defend Earth from threats with its power, which rivals the gods. Thor is forced to fight it to defend himself after Loki sends it after him. This is pretty much the same plot as the Destroyer's original comics. Mjolnir is Thor's powerful hammer that can summon lightning and can only be held by those who are worthy. In this film, many people try to excavate it, but only Thor is able to wield the hammer in the film. In the end credits scene, Nick Fury asks Selvig, one of Jane Foster's scientist friends, to investigate the Tesseract. However, Selvig is being influenced by Loki. This is further set up for the upcoming Avengers film. Stan Lee has a cameo, like in all these films, where he tries to pull Thor's hammer out of the ground, but he fails and loses his back bumper. My thoughts on this film: I liked it more than the last couple times I watched it, but honestly, it's just a bit boring. There's some cool moments, and Asgard is well designed, but the costumes are a little bit bland, and some of the makeup, like Thor's dyed eyebrows, is a little jarring. It also has the problem where Thor loses his powers for a lot of the film, which is a bit of a boring plot twist. Set-piece wise, things like the initial Frost Giant battle were cool, and the final battle on the Frost Bridge were also pretty cool. Visually, this film actually has a lot going for it when it's doing visually cool things. Things like the town were shot kind of boring, and were a pretty lame diversion from what we were seeing on Asgard. And Loki was a fun villain, if not fully established to the level of later films, but Tom Hiddleston is pretty fun. And you can definitely see some potential in Chris Hemsworth, though he's a bit bland in this film. As for the score, it's a bit generic, but it works. It's nothing you'll really maintain outside of watching the film, and is pretty passable, I guess, much like all these MCU films, but nothing that's crazy good like we would see with a few films later on. In terms of a reading list, I'd suggest Mighty Marvel Masterworks #1, which covers Journey into Mystery 83 through 100. It's a pretty solid introduction to Marvel's Thor, and it'll get the job done. I also read Journey into Mystery 118 for this so that I could learn more about the Destroyer. Thor is going to be our first film we cover that has a one-shot or a short film accompanied with it. The Consultant is a short film that basically explains why Tony Stark was in the end credits of The Incredible Hulk. It's okay, and it makes some sense of why Nick Fury wasn't in the end of The Incredible Hulk, but it feels like a bit of a backstep to kind of explain things that happened in Iron Man 2 than a strong short film in and of itself. In conclusion, Thor is a watchable film with further ties to the upcoming Avengers film, but I find it as a film in its own right to be pretty skippable, as it's kind of boring aside from a few cool set pieces. Asgard's really cool, as well as Jotunheim, the home of the Frost Giants, but even some cool imagery can't save the film from being a bit dull. Ultimately, the film is another step towards creating Marvel's expansive universe and proves that not all films need to be grounded on Earth. But yeah, it's pretty skippable. If you're just looking for the highlights of the MCU, I would say pass on this one. Captain America: The First Avenger may have been the MCU film I was the most excited to see before release. I was a big comic fan at the time, and as a young kid, this guy with a shield who fights spies and Nazis was pretty cool, so imagine my excitement when this film was announced. I remember being a bit unsure when Chris Evans was cast, who I wasn't super familiar with, besides his role as the Human Torch in the early 2000s Fantastic Four films. But not unlike Robert Downey Jr., they hit a home run with the casting, and Chris Evans proved to be a solid choice for Captain America. Captain America's had several adaptations before the MCU, not too dissimilar to the Hulk, but Captain America's original adaptations had a bit of a hard time adapting the character to the screen. First, we had a serial, which was a 15-part episodic miniseries. Essentially, in this film, Captain America's lore is thrown out and replaced with Grant Gardner, a district attorney who doubles as Captain America, a non-shield-wielding version that needs to stop a giant evil vibrator that will destroy a building and kill people. It's 3 hours long and Marvel's only big screen appearance until Howard the Duck almost 50 years later. The 70s version is a duology of films where Steve Rogers is a biker who lives a breezy California lifestyle until he takes a serum called Flag, which gives him enhanced strength, speed, etc. Much like the 1940s versions, these films kind of miss the point of the character and throw out most of the lore. However, this one's closer to the comics, bar the Surfer Bro personality, clear shield, surfer van, and Evel Knievel costume. In the 1990s, the infamous schlockmeister Albert Pune adapted Captain America, and it's the most accurate version, at least attempting to adapt the comic to the screen. I would say it's accurate in the same way the 1989 Batman is accurate, where all the elements are there, just remixed for the screen adaptation. It's probably the best Captain America movie up to this point, but still has a low budget, keeping it from being as well regarded as something like Batman, and some of the acting and scenarios are a little bit choppy, but overall it's okay. Captain America the First Avenger follows Steve Rogers, who's a scrawny man who wants nothing more than to fight for his country, but unfortunately for him, he's too weak and is asthmatic. This is when he meets the scientist Abraham Erskine, who's looking for ideal candidates for a super soldier serum he was developing. After a trial period, Steve is selected, but while he's being enhanced, Abraham is killed, his formula dying with him. The army is unsure what to do with Steve, so they make him a USO exhibit, but eventually after learning his best friend Bucky is captured, Steve goes rogue and fully embraces his new identity as Captain America. Meanwhile, the Red Skull, Abraham's original test subject, has found the Tesseract, which is a mystical MacGuffin that has powers Red Skull hopes to harness. After infiltrating several Hydra bases, the offshoot of the Nazis helmed by Red Skull, Captain America's friend Bucky is killed, and this eventually leads to a final confrontation with Red Skull. Captain America gets the best of him, but is forced to sink Red Skull's airplane into the ice, where he would be frozen until the upcoming Avengers movie at the time. Obviously, as I stated, Captain America has had several films before the first Avenger, but none that were really large-scale Hollywood blockbusters like this was. That process started in the late 90s, but nothing would materialize due to a lawsuit with Joe Simon over the ownership of Captain America, Joe Simon being one of the original creators of Captain America along with Jack Kirby. Following the conclusion of that lawsuit, Marvel thought about licensing the rights to Warner Brothers, but would eventually decide to do the film themselves. Joe Johnston was approached to direct, who worked on another superhero period piece, The Rocketeer, and I think that was a pretty wise choice for Marvel. Chris Evans would be cast, and like I said, would be a bit of a worrisome casting choice, but after the movie's release was pretty well embraced in the role. Captain America is pretty similar to his comics counterpart, with him essentially being a wannabe soldier with a good heart who only wants what's best for the little man, and uses his enhanced powers to essentially fight bullies and bad guys. In the comics, he wouldn't be frozen like in the films and fight into the 1950s until a complex series of retcons I may make into its own video eventually. But anyhow, after the retcons, he's frozen and revived by the Avengers for the Avengers comic, not too unlike his film counterpart, which would see him canonically on ice until the Avengers film. Bucky is aged up from the comics, going from a kid to an adult. The dynamic between him and Captain America has changed a bit too, having Bucky stand up for Cap when he is weak and defenseless, and eventually when evolving into his super form, still having his back and rooting for him. This is also a good motivator for Steve when he's seemingly killed off towards the end of the film. Peggy, like Bucky, is support and motivation for Steve. She is probably the most proactive love interest to this point in the MCU, and her and Steve's doomed love makes for a somewhat compelling arc. The Howling Commandos, like the Warriors 3 and Thor, are pretty much background characters, but it's fun to have them in the MCU, despite it being an extended cameo. In the comics, they worked with Nick Fury extensively during the Korean War. Red Skull wants to harness the power of the Tesseract, much like Steve, who is also enhanced by Super Soldier Serum. Much like in the comics, he's the leader of Hydra and is an evil Nazi. That's pretty much all you need to know about him. Zola is a scientist that works for the Red Skull in the comics. He's most famous for being a weird evil robot, but in this film he's just a normal scientist, his weird evil robot phase coming later in the timeline. The Tesseract is a magical MacGuffin that Red Skull uses to power his devices and weapons he was creating. On a macro level, it's the first Infinity Stone we see, the Space Stone. I'm not going to go into too much detail explaining what the Infinity Stones are at this point, but just understand they'll be pretty pivotal to the Infinity Saga as a whole. Captain America has a shield given to him by Howard Stark, Tony Stark's father. It is invulnerable to most things, being made of vibranium, a nearly indestructible metal. He can throw it and it'll come back. It's a pretty simple concept and pretty similar to the comics adaptations. Captain America has a suit he was using for the USO show that would inspire his look from the actual costumes along the way. It comes equipped with a shield, and it's pretty much a straight reference to Captain America's Golden Age comic suit, mixed with a little bit of the Silver Age suit as well. Once Captain America actually goes into the field, he's outfitted with a more tactical suit. It's a nice homage to the comics, but is a more unique design, informed by a military uniform from World War II. I'd most closely compare it to Ultimate Comics' adaptation of Captain America and his World War II suit from the comics. For this video, I read Captain America Comics 1-4 through Marvel Masterworks. It's an interesting read, but is more or less propaganda with somewhat problematic elements. It's a fun way to read the adventures that would loosely adapt into this story. During the end credits scene, Nick Fury talks with the recently unfrozen Steve Rogers, who's adjusting to a new world. He gives Steve his next assignment, which would be the mission from the Avengers movie. Stan Lee has a cameo as always in this, but it's pretty boring. It's just a generic general, and definitely not his most crazy cameo. Overall, it's pretty quick and basic. I think Captain America the First Avenger is a pretty decent film, mostly. It's a good coming-of-age story of sorts, and the World War II setting allows for this symbol of good to have a good, albeit fairly simple villain in Hydra and the Nazis. It's very black and white, but establishes a good superhero character despite his inherent lack of depth. It's shot well enough, and the score is actually fairly notable for once, but the Captain America stuff feels a bit breezed over towards the end of the film, not showing much besides a montage. All in all, it's a good film with some pacing flaws, but it modernizes the 1940 comics and tells them in a less racist, more epic film way. The music by Alan Silvestri I think is actually quite fitting, and I like it quite a bit. It's probably the first MCU score I actually think is fairly memorable. This film includes a one-shot. A funny thing happened on the way to Thor's hammer. It was a short where Agent Coulson goes and fights some robbers. It's kind of fun. I don't have much to say about it. Just glad it wasn't backstepping a continuity error like the one from Thor. Overall, I recommend Captain America. It's fun, fast-paced, and cool seeing World War II through the lens of the Marvel Universe. Like I said, Chris Evans embraced the role and became one of the more iconic roles in the MCU. It's fast-paced and breezy. I almost felt like the film could have stood to be a little longer to flesh out some of the battles Captain America fought in, but it's Hollywood, and especially in the early MCU, it wouldn't make much business sense for them to have this as a 2.5-hour runtime because that would be fairly risky. That said, I like it quite a bit for what it is. I remember it feeling like everyone was looking forward to the Avengers. After all, it was the first time in recent decades several major film franchises crossed over, and Marvel was putting to the test whether or not the concept of a mega crossover could work on the big screen, and for that matter, if it could work in the action genre, as previously big crossovers were mostly a horror trope. Think Freddy vs. Jason, Alien vs. Predator, or the numerous examples Universal churned out with their monsters during the 30s and 40s. Anyhow, let's take a look back at Marvel's The Avengers. Avengers follows Thor, Captain America, Iron Man, Hulk, Black Widow, and Hawkeye, who converge after Loki begins to harness the power of the Tesseract. See my Captain America the First Avenger video for more information on that. The team butts heads, but ultimately comes together to defeat Loki and his army of Chitauri soldiers. The plot has slightly more to do than that, but we'll get back to that soon. The idea for the Avengers began in 2003, but essentially went nowhere when Marvel began releasing its own films. However, eventually the plans were revived. Marvel had a plan to establish their own characters with their own films, which ended up working out and laid the groundwork for the MCU. In 2010, Joss Whedon signed on as director and began reworking the script, and the Hulk would be recast from Ed Norton to Mark Ruffalo. Marvel claimed that Norton wasn't a team player, while Norton said he didn't want to be locked into the Hulk role. Either way, the studio would move on from Norton and go on to Ruffalo, who has played the Hulk ever since. It's worth noting this decision did not decanonize Norton's Incredible Hulk, with several key actors returning down the line, and that film being referenced in the Avengers. So Avengers films tend to have a lot of characters and a lot of plot lines, so buckle in for this. Iron Man or Tony Stark is working on rebuilding Stark Tower when he's called to join the Avengers, despite his previous denial of the role. Captain America or Steve Rogers is called in as he's adjusting to the new world he finds himself trapped in. In the film, he finds himself at odds with Tony and his pessimistic worldview, but ultimately proves to be a strong leader during the Battle of New York towards the end of the film. The Hulk or Bruce Banner is called in to help trace the gamma signatures coming off the Tesseract, but eventually has to become the Hulk during the Battle in New York to help defend the city. He probably has the most complicated arc in the film, having to ultimately come to terms with his bad side while the world is in need. Thor joins the Avengers since Loki, his brother, is getting out of hand with his use of the Tesseract and Thor wants to take it from him. Sadly, there isn't a ton to say about Thor in this film. Black Widow or Natasha Romanoff must put her spying aside and help the Avengers fight the Chitauri. Meanwhile, she's also trying to solve the puzzle of why her friend Hawkeye has gone rogue. Hawkeye or Clint Barton is a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent who's quickly possessed by Loki towards the end of the second act. He snaps out of his hypnosis and helps the other Avengers during the Battle of New York. Loki wants the power of the Tesseract to take over the world. He's able to do this through his army of Chitauri fighters, with help from people he brainwashes along the way as well. Phil Coulson is a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent who's a super fan of Captain America and helped assemble the Avengers. Midway through the film, he's killed, however, and this is used to rally the Avengers into assembling during the Battle of New York. Nick Fury assembles the Avengers due to the threat of invasion, while simultaneously trying to get through the red tape and politics one would expect from fighting off an alien invasion. As for the Avengers as a whole, I think it was a pretty good starting lineup. However, in the comics, the team was slightly different when they formed, consisting of Iron Man, Hulk, Thor, Ant-Man, and the Wasp, with Captain America coming in issue 4. Hawkeye makes a lot of sense as an addition to the starting roster, as he's pretty notable being a long-standing Avenger. However, Black Widow was never a consistent staple of the Avengers. This film has the first instance of our main villain of the Infinity Saga, Thanos, briefly showing up. It's nothing special, but it was a big moment seeing this in theaters as a comic fan, and especially cool given how well the Infinity Saga turned out as a whole. The Avengers has a fair bit of equipment and other gadgets, but surprisingly not as much new stuff as you may expect. It has the Tesseract again, which has the Space Stone from the Infinity Stones, but the film also has Loki's Scepter, which can control minds and shoot energy beams. This is due to the fact that it harnesses the power of the Mind Stone, which we will talk about in a future video. In terms of Iron Man's armors, Tony hasn't started the film with an upgrade, still rocking the Mach 6 from Iron Man 2, but by the end of the film he gets his Mach 7, which is visually similar to his Mach 4 armor, but can now be called on demand through bracelets that Tony can wear. Captain America gets a new shield in the film, along with a new armor, which modernizes his World War II look. Along with those, Hawkeye shows off his bow and quiver set for the first time, along with an appearance from Black Widow's stingers. This may be a hot take, but I'm not in love with the Avengers. The dialogue is a little stilted and cheesy, the cinematography is fucking awful, and the film is kind of soap opera-y. But I do find the action pretty fun, and Robert Downey Jr., Tom Hiddleston, and Chris Evans have standout performances in the film. The biggest problem is a lot of the movie is flat and boring, both to watch and to look at. This isn't a favorite of mine overall, and I think it falls pretty far below the other 3 Avengers films. And while I don't love the movie, Avengers has one of the standout scores of the MCU. It's catchy, intense, and gives me goosebumps. It certainly elevates the sequences that it's in, and that final battle when it plays is just downright inspiring. For this video, I'd recommend reading at least Avengers 1 through 4 from the original comic run by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. It'll familiarize you with most of the characters and give you an understanding of how the Avengers differ between the page and the screen. Much like a lot of these films from Phase 1, this film does include a one-shot on the Blu-ray, and I believe they're on Disney Plus as well. And this one is Item 47. It's our next short film, and probably the first one that's a legit short film, being 12 minutes in length and having more of a narrative structure than the past ones, which are more like bonus clips. This stars Benny and Claire, who commit a series of robberies after getting a Chitauri weapon and eventually being caught and joining S.H.I.E.L.D. It's a little boring, but it's directed well enough, and it's an amusing enough bonus feature. Overall, this is a cool event film, but has been replaced in scope and general cinematic achievement with better MCU event films like Captain America Civil War, Avengers Infinity War, or Avengers Endgame. And while it has a handful of moments, I think this film has some of the worst directing and cinematography of the wider MCU, only really saved by an okay, albeit boring at times, script.